In the winter of 1921, in a city still bleeding from the collapse of empires, a single medical file was stamped, sealed, and quietly removed from public reach. It contained no prophecy, no occult symbols, no language of myth. What made it dangerous was something far more unsettling: measurements, blood samples, family records, and clinical observations that should not have been able to coexist on the same page. According to the doctors who signed it, the woman described inside did not merely suffer from a rare condition. Her very existence contradicted the foundational rules of biological inheritance as they were understood at the time. And perhaps more disturbingly, as we understand them now, Prague in 1921 was a city suspended between centuries. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed only 3 years earlier, leaving behind fractured borders, wounded veterans, and institutions struggling to redefine themselves. Streets that once echoed with imperial certainty now whispered with uncertainty. Hunger, disease, and trauma were common, but so was ambition. Science, especially medicine, was seen as a way forward, a tool to rebuild, to modernize, to explain what war and history had broken. Hospitals became places not only of healing, but of experimentation. And universities, desperate to reclaim relevance, pushed their brightest minds toward discovery at almost any cost. It was in this environment that a woman, whose name appears only sporadically in surviving documents, entered a Prague hospital for what should have been a routine examination. There was nothing remarkable about her at first glance. She was not disfigured. She was not visibly ill. She did not behave erratically. By all outward appearances, she was ordinary. That ordinariness is what makes the story so unsettling. Because whatever she was, whatever her blood carried, it hid perfectly beneath the surface. The initial reason for her admission varies depending on which fragment of the archive you read. Some suggest chronic fatigue. Others mention unexplained dizziness. One note, written in faded ink, simply reads, "Patient requests evaluation." There is no urgency in the phrasing, no hint that this would become one of the most quietly disturbing medical cases of the early 20th century. And yet, within days, the tone of the documentation changes. Margins fill with corrections. Test results are circled, then crossed out, then repeated. Language that had once been confident becomes cautious. Words like anomaly and irregularity begin to appear with increasing frequency. To understand why this mattered so deeply, it is important to remember what genetics meant in 1921. The word itself was still young. Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance had only been rediscovered at the turn of the century, and though his laws were gaining acceptance, they were treated with near-religious certainty. Traits passed from parent to child in predictable patterns. Blood types followed rules. Lineage could be mapped. The idea that a human being could emerge outside those rules was not just troubling, it was destabilizing. If inheritance could fail, then what else was assumed but untrue? The first blood test performed on the woman was not meant to answer grand questions. It was standard procedure. A baseline. Something to confirm health, not to challenge theory. But the result did exactly that. The numbers did not align. The markers contradicted one another. According to the chart, her blood simultaneously expressed characteristics that should have been mutually exclusive. At first, the assumption was error. Contamination. A mislabeled sample. The test was repeated. Then repeated again. And again. Each time, the result remained the same. What followed was not panic, but silence. Not chaos, but withdrawal. The medical staff involved in the case stopped discussing it openly. Notes became shorter, less descriptive. One entry states simply, "Further discussion deferred." Another reads, "Results confirmed. Implications unclear." For doctors trained to explain, to diagnose, to classify, uncertainty was intolerable. Yet this uncertainty could not be resolved by additional testing alone. It demanded explanation, and explanation demanded consequences. The woman, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the significance of what was happening around her. There is no evidence that anyone explained the implications of her test results to her in full. Patients in that era were rarely treated as collaborators in their own care. She would have noticed the increased attention, the change in demeanor, the way conversations stopped when she entered the room. But whether she understood that her blood had become a problem, an intellectual problem, a political problem, is unclear. What is clear is that her case did not remain confined to the hospital for long. Within weeks, references to external consultations begin appearing in the margins. professors, ministry officials, names abbreviated or replaced entirely with titles. This was no longer just medicine. This was review, oversight, control. Why would a single patient provoke such interest? Because she represented something that institutions fear more than illness: contradiction. If her bloodline truly could not exist according to established genetic laws, then either those laws were incomplete, or someone, somewhere, had made a mistake too large to acknowledge. In an era already destabilized by war and political collapse, the idea that biology itself might be unreliable was not something authorities were eager to confront publicly. The file that survives today is incomplete. Pages are missing. Dates skip forward without explanation. But enough remains to suggest that a decision was made. A decision not about treatment, but about containment. Not of a disease, but of information. The woman was no longer just a patient. She was a liability. And yet, despite attempts to suppress the case, it was never fully erased. References appear decades later in unrelated genetic discussions. A footnote here. A passing mention there. Always vague. Always careful. As if acknowledging the case directly might somehow reawaken it. Modern researchers who have encountered these fragments describe a similar reaction: disbelief followed by discomfort. Not because the case proves something supernatural, but because it reveals how fragile certainty can be when reality refuses to cooperate. This story is not about monsters or miracles. It is about a moment when science encountered a human being who did not fit its rules, and instead of adapting, chose to look away. It is about how easily a life can be reduced to data, then hidden when that data becomes inconvenient. And it is about a bloodline that, according to every principle meant to define it, should never have existed at all. What follows is not speculation, but reconstruction. From surviving records, historical context, and modern understanding, we can begin to piece together what happened in Prague in 1921, and why, more than a century later, it still unsettles those who study it. To understand how a single medical case could quietly slip into obscurity while simultaneously alarming some of the most educated minds of its time, it is necessary to understand the city in which it unfolded. Prague in the early 1920s was not merely a backdrop. It was an active participant in the story. The city had survived the collapse of an empire and emerged as part of a new nation, Czechoslovakia, but the transition was anything but smooth. Political borders had shifted, loyalties had fractured, and institutions that once operated under imperial authority were suddenly forced to redefine themselves. In this atmosphere, uncertainty was not an exception, it was the norm. The Great War had ended only a few years earlier, yet its consequences were everywhere. Hospitals were overcrowded with wounded veterans, amputees, and patients suffering from what would later be understood as psychological trauma. Medical professionals worked under constant strain, balancing limited resources against an overwhelming demand for care. At the same time, this pressure created opportunity. War had accelerated medical innovation, forcing doctors to experiment, to improvise, and to accept risks that peacetime medicine might have avoided. In Prague, as in many European cities, this mindset carried over into the post-war period. Science was no longer just a pursuit of knowledge. It was seen as a means of national recovery. Universities and research institutes were encouraged to produce breakthroughs that could place the young nation on equal footing with older European powers. Charles University, one of the oldest and most respected institutions in Central Europe, became a focal point of this ambition. Its medical faculty attracted researchers eager to push boundaries, especially in emerging fields like genetics, hematology, and experimental pathology. The language of progress filled lecture halls, but beneath it lay a more troubling reality. Ethical guidelines were vague, oversight was inconsistent, and the rights of patients were often secondary to the promise of discovery. Prague itself embodied contradiction. Gothic cathedrals and medieval alleyways stood beside modern laboratories and newly electrified streets. Superstition and folklore still lingered in the public consciousness, even as scientific rationalism gained authority. This duality mattered. It shaped how anomalies were perceived. A medical irregularity could be framed as a curiosity, a curse, or a breakthrough depending on who encountered it. And when such an irregularity threatened accepted knowledge, it was often easier to isolate it than to explain it. The political climate also played a crucial role. The new Czechoslovak government was deeply invested in projecting stability and modernity. Any suggestion that its institutions were incapable of controlling or understanding scientific matters risked undermining public confidence. At the same time, Europe was entering an era where biology and politics became increasingly entangled. Ideas about heredity, racial purity, and genetic destiny were gaining traction across the continent. Although the most extreme consequences of these ideas were still years away, their foundations were already being laid in academic journals and policy discussions. In this context, genetics was not a neutral science. It was imbued with ideological weight. Bloodlines were not just biological constructs, they were symbols of identity, continuity, and perceived superiority. The notion that a person's genetic makeup could defy classification was more than a scientific puzzle. It was a threat to narratives that many institutions were beginning to rely upon. An unexplainable blood profile raised uncomfortable questions about lineage, ancestry, and the reliability of biological categorization itself. Medical practice in Prague reflected these tensions. Hospitals were hierarchical, male-dominated, and governed by authority rather than transparency. Decisions were made behind closed doors, and dissent was rarely documented. A junior physician who questioned a senior professor risked professional ruin. As a result, when something did not make sense, it was often discussed in private, if at all. Records from this period show a pattern of euphemism and omission, particularly in cases deemed sensitive or embarrassing. Another factor that cannot be ignored is the lingering influence of military medicine. Many of the doctors working in civilian hospitals had served during the war. They were accustomed to treating bodies as systems to be managed efficiently, sometimes ruthlessly. Individual suffering was often secondary to the broader objective. This mentality made it easier to view patients as subjects rather than people, especially when their cases promised valuable data. Prague's geographic and cultural position also contributed to its role as a scientific crossroads. Situated between Western and Eastern Europe, the city attracted ideas from both spheres. Researchers exchanged correspondence with colleagues in Germany, Austria, and beyond. This flow of information meant that unusual findings did not remain isolated for long. At the same time, it increased pressure to conform to dominant theories. A discovery that contradicted widely accepted models risked ridicule or rejection on the international stage. Against this backdrop, secrecy was not always sinister, it was practical. Institutions feared losing credibility. Governments feared unrest. Academics feared professional marginalization. When confronted with something they could not explain, many chose silence over confrontation. It was safer to lock a file away than to challenge the framework upon which reputations were built. The city's social structure further reinforced this tendency. Class divisions were pronounced, and access to power was uneven. A patient without wealth or influence had little recourse if their case was mishandled or suppressed. Complaints could be ignored. Records could be altered. Names could be misspelled or omitted entirely. In such an environment, disappearance did not require conspiracy. It required indifference. Yet for all its flaws, Prague was also a place of intellectual courage. There were those who sensed that existing models were incomplete, that human biology might be more complex than the neat diagrams in textbooks. These individuals left subtle traces in the archives, question marks in margins, cautious phrases that hinted at doubt. They did not overturn the system, but they preserved enough uncertainty for future generations to notice. This is why the case that emerged in 1921 could exist at all. The city's contradictions allowed it to surface, even as they ensured it would be buried. Prague was advanced enough to recognize an anomaly, but constrained enough to suppress it. It was modern enough to test blood scientifically, yet traditional enough to fear the implications of what those tests revealed. Understanding this environment does not explain the anomaly itself, but it explains the response to it. It explains why a woman could become the center of a classified genetic mystery without ever appearing in newspapers or public discourse. It explains how science, politics, and culture intersected to create a perfect condition for erasure. In the shadows of Prague's laboratories and lecture halls, knowledge advanced unevenly. Some truths were pursued aggressively, while others were quietly set aside. The woman's case fell into the latter category, not because it lacked importance, but because it possessed too much of it. The woman at the center of the case enters the historical record almost accidentally, as if she were never meant to be seen at all. Her name appears inconsistently, spelled differently across documents, sometimes replaced with initials, sometimes omitted entirely. This was not unusual for patients of her social standing in the early 20th century, especially women whose lives were considered medically unremarkable. What makes her presence unsettling is not how loudly she appears in the archives, but how quietly, and how quickly attention gathers around her once she does. From what can be reconstructed, she was in her late 20s or early 30s in 1921. She was unmarried, lived modestly, and worked in a position that required no formal education. There is nothing in the surviving descriptions to suggest she came from wealth or influence. She was not politically connected. But medicine rarely ends where it begins. What prompted further testing remains ambiguous. Some documents suggest anemia. Others refer to irregular fatigue that could not be explained by workload or nutrition. There is mention of faintness, though not frequent enough to suggest a neurological condition. These complaints were common in post-war Europe, especially among women, and were often dismissed. That they were not dismissed in her case suggests that something in the initial assessment raised quiet concern. The first laboratory results did not alarm anyone. It was only when blood analysis was conducted, routine by modern standards, but still relatively novel at the time, that the case began to change. Blood typing had become an important tool for transfusions, especially after the war. Hospitals were refining their techniques, eager to apply science to reduce fatal errors. In this environment, blood was data, and her blood refused to behave. At first, the physicians involved assumed the fault lay with their instruments. Prague's laboratories, though ambitious, were not always consistent in quality. Equipment was reused. Reagents were scarce. Human error was common. The simplest explanation was a technical one. So the sample was taken again. And again. Each time, the results contradicted expectations. What is notable is how quickly the tone of the medical notes shifts from detached observation to guarded curiosity. Physicians who had initially treated her like any other patient began to describe her as a case. The language becomes less personal. She is no longer the patient, but the subject. This linguistic shift is subtle but significant. It marks the moment when her individuality begins to dissolve into abstraction. Despite this, there is evidence that she remained physically present and emotionally aware of what was happening around her. One fragment mentions her asking why so many doctors were involved in her care. Another records that she requested to leave the hospital temporarily and was advised to remain for further observation. There is no record of her refusing treatment, nor of her being formally detained. But the imbalance of power was absolute. Consent, as understood today, did not exist. Her family history was investigated next. This was standard practice when hereditary questions arose, but the depth of the inquiry suggests unusual concern. Physicians traced her lineage back several generations using parish records, census documents, and oral accounts. These records were often unreliable, but they were considered sufficient to establish patterns. In her case, those patterns should have been straightforward. They were not. According to the documentation, her parents were biologically consistent with one another. There was no indication of adoption, extramarital birth, or record alteration. Grandparents, too, appeared unremarkable. No known intermarriage between close relatives. No documented congenital conditions. The kind of family tree that medical textbooks loved, because it confirmed theory rather than challenged it. And yet, when compared against her blood analysis, that tree made no sense. This contradiction placed her in a dangerous position. She was not ill enough to be treated conventionally, but anomalous enough to be scrutinized. She existed in a liminal space between patient and problem. Physicians were trained to resolve such spaces by classification. If something could not be classified, it had to be isolated. The records suggest that she was moved between departments under the pretext of further evaluation. Each transfer removed her slightly from normal patient flow and placed her deeper within the institutional machinery. Fewer nurses interacted with her. Fewer casual observations were recorded. Instead, her file accumulated annotations from specialists who may never have met her directly. There is no indication that she understood the nature of these consultations. From her perspective, she was likely experiencing prolonged hospitalization without clear answers. In an era when hospitals were often associated with death rather than recovery, this alone would have been distressing. Yet there is no dramatic record of resistance or panic. If anything, her compliance may have made her easier to study, and easier to forget as a person. One of the most haunting aspects of her case is the absence of her own voice. There are no letters, no diaries, no testimonies. Everything we know about her comes filtered through institutional language. This was common for the time, but in her case, it amplifies the unease. We are left to imagine her reactions based on context: confusion, perhaps, or quiet resignation. Or maybe she sensed that something was wrong, but lacked the words to articulate it. As interest in her case grew, so did the distance between her and those studying her. The doctors writing the most speculative notes were often not the ones providing her daily care. They saw her as an entry in a ledger, a problem to be solved. This separation allowed ethical discomfort to be abstracted away. It is easier to debate theory when the human consequences remain unseen. Her status as a woman further complicated matters. Female patients were often dismissed when their symptoms did not align neatly with known conditions, yet paradoxically subjected to invasive scrutiny when their bodies deviated from expectations. Medicine of the time was deeply gendered, and women's bodies were frequently treated as unstable or mysterious by default. This cultural bias made it easier to frame her anomaly as something to be managed rather than understood. Still, there is no evidence that she was mistreated in overt ways. No mention of physical harm. No record of experimental procedures that would leave visible traces. The harm, if it occurred, was quieter. It lay in the gradual stripping away of agency, the reduction of a life to a set of contradictory numbers, and the eventual disappearance of that life from the narrative altogether. By the time her name begins to fade from the records, her case has already taken on a life of its own within academic circles. Discussions reference the Prague anomaly or the 1921 blood inconsistency, without ever mentioning the person at its center. She becomes a concept, a cautionary example, a footnote waiting to happen. And then, abruptly, she is gone. No discharge summary survives. No death certificate has been conclusively linked to her. No record of relocation or marriage appears with certainty. The woman who once walked into a hospital seeking answers becomes indistinguishable from the silence that follows her. What remains is not a portrait, but an absence shaped like a person. A reminder that behind every classified case, every sealed file, there was once a human being whose life intersected with knowledge at precisely the wrong moment. The moment her blood was first drawn, nothing about the procedure suggested it would become the axis upon which the entire case would turn. Blood tests in 1921 were not the sophisticated genomic analyses of today, but they were precise enough to establish basic truths. Blood typing, refined during the war to prevent fatal transfusion errors, had become a cornerstone of modern medicine. Doctors trusted it. It followed rules. Those rules were simple, repeatable, and reassuring. Until they weren't. The initial analysis was conducted as part of a routine diagnostic process. A small vial, carefully labeled, sent to a laboratory accustomed to processing dozens of samples a day. The expectation was confirmation, not discovery. But when the results were returned, they did not align with any known classification. At first glance, it appeared to be a clerical error. The markers suggested one blood type, while secondary indicators implied another. In isolation, such inconsistencies could be dismissed. In combination, they were inexplicable. The attending physician reportedly requested a second test without informing the patient of any irregularity. This was standard practice. Patients were rarely told about inconclusive results, especially when the issue was presumed technical. The second test was performed using a fresh sample, drawn under observation, labeled by 2 staff members. The result was identical to the first. At this point, the assumption shifted from human error to methodological flaw. The laboratory equipment was examined. Reagents were replaced. Controls were run. Nothing suggested contamination or malfunction. A third test was ordered, this time overseen by a senior technician. Once again, the result defied classification. The language used in the laboratory notes begins to change here. Where earlier entries were confident and procedural, later ones are cautious, even hesitant. Words like unexpected and irregular appear with increasing frequency. One note simply states, findings persist. Another adds, almost as an aside, inheritance incongruent. To understand why this was so disturbing, it is important to understand what blood represented to medical science at the time. Blood was not just a substance, it was a map. It carried information about ancestry, compatibility, and identity. Blood types followed inheritance patterns that were considered reliable and universal. A child's blood type could be predicted based on their parents. This predictability was foundational. It allowed doctors to make decisions with confidence and reinforced the idea that biology followed rules that could be learned and applied. Her blood challenged that certainty. According to the records, Her sample expressed characteristics that should not have coexisted. It was not simply rare, it was contradictory. Some markers suggested one lineage, while others pointed in an entirely different direction. Attempts to force the results into existing categories failed. She did not fit at the margins of known science, she sat outside it altogether. The immediate response was not to publicize the anomaly, but to contain it. Additional tests were ordered, but discussion was limited. Only a small circle of physicians was informed of the details. This was not secrecy born of malice, but of discomfort. Science, particularly in its early stages, often responds to contradiction by retreating inward. Before challenging theory, practitioners exhaust every possibility that preserves it. As the tests continued, patterns emerged that deepened the unease. The anomaly was stable. It did not fluctuate over time or under different conditions. This ruled out transient factors such as illness or environmental exposure. Her blood was consistent in its inconsistency. Whatever was causing the anomaly was not external. It was intrinsic. This realization marked a turning point. If the issue were external, it could be treated or dismissed. If intrinsic, it demanded explanation. And explanation, in this case, threatened to undermine accepted knowledge. The physicians involved began consulting textbooks, correspondence, and international journals. There were reports of rare blood types, unusual reactions, and unexplained transfusion failures. None matched her profile. Some cases described partial anomalies. Others described conditions later understood as chimerism or mosaicism, though such terms were not yet in use. But none described a complete contradiction of inheritance patterns in an otherwise healthy adult. As the search for precedent failed, the tone of the documentation grew more guarded. Questions replaced statements. One note asks, possibility of dual origin. Another wonders whether unrecorded lineage could explain the findings. These were not accusations, but acknowledgments of uncertainty. And uncertainty, in medicine, is dangerous. The patient herself remained largely unaware of the significance of these discussions. There is no record of her being told that her blood was anomalous. She may have been informed that further tests were necessary, but the language used with patients was typically vague. To tell her that her blood defied explanation would have served no therapeutic purpose and might have caused distress. Or so the reasoning likely went. Yet the consequences of this decision were profound. By withholding information, the physicians maintained control over the narrative. The case became something that happened around her, not to her. She was present, but excluded. As news of the anomaly spread within select circles, interest intensified. Specialists from outside the hospital were invited to review the findings. Some repeated the tests independently. The results were the same. Each confirmation tightened the knot of concern. The anomaly was real. It was reproducible. And it was unexplained. At this stage, the case began to shift from clinical to theoretical. The woman's blood was no longer being examined solely to diagnose or treat her. It was being examined to answer broader questions about biology itself. This shift is evident in the notes, which increasingly reference inheritance models and theoretical implications rather than symptoms or care. One particularly telling annotation appears in the margin of a report. If accepted, revision required. It is unclear what exactly would need revision: classification systems, inheritance laws, or something more fundamental, but the implication is unmistakable. Accepting her blood profile as legitimate would force change. And change, especially change that undermines authority, is rarely welcomed. The possibility of error was revisited repeatedly, but each avenue closed itself. The consistency of the findings left little room for dismissal. At the same time, the absence of any visible abnormality in the patient complicated matters. She was not visibly ill. She functioned normally. There was no crisis to justify aggressive intervention. This made the anomaly harder to contextualize and easier to ignore. As days turned into weeks, the blood tests became both the center of the case and a barrier to resolution. They proved that something was wrong, or at least different, but offered no guidance on what to do next. The patient lingered in a state of medical limbo, neither discharged nor treated, while her blood circulated through laboratories and discussions she would never hear. The fear was not that her blood posed an immediate danger, but that it posed a conceptual one. If her anomaly were acknowledged publicly, it would invite scrutiny, debate, and doubt. In a field striving for legitimacy and authority, doubt was corrosive. It could erode trust not only in specific practitioners, but in the scientific enterprise itself. So the blood test that should have been a footnote became a fault line. On one side stood the patient, waiting for answers. On the other stood a system confronted with its own limitations. Between them lay a vial of blood that refused to conform. This was the moment the case crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer just about one woman's health. It was about whether science was willing to admit that its rules were incomplete. And in Prague in 1921, the answer to that question would shape everything that followed. Once the limits of laboratory testing had been reached, attention turned to the one place where order was supposed to exist beyond doubt: ancestry. If her blood refused to conform to scientific expectation, then perhaps the explanation lay not in the present, but in the past. Lineage had long been medicine's refuge when the body became confusing. Family trees, parish records, and generational patterns were treated as anchors of certainty, especially in an era when genetics was still intertwined with genealogy. If her blood appeared impossible, then something in her recorded history must be wrong. Or so the physicians believed. The process of reconstructing her ancestry was methodical, almost obsessive. Birth records were requested from parish officers. Marriage certificates were reviewed. Death registries were cross-checked for consistency. In small communities, these records often carried more authority than scientific data, because they were perceived as social facts rather than theoretical constructs. Names, dates, and relationships were assumed to be stable truths. And in her case, those truths appeared disturbingly intact. Her parents were identified without difficulty. Both were documented residents of Prague and surrounding regions, their lives unremarkable by historical standards. There was no record of adoption, no suggestion of illegitimacy, no indication that her birth had been concealed or altered. Her mother's medical history, as far as it could be reconstructed, showed nothing unusual. Her father's occupation and military service were noted, but revealed no anomalies. If her blood defied inheritance laws, it was not because her parents were unknown. The investigation moved outward. Grandparents were traced through church books that predated the modern state. These records, written in careful script, revealed continuity rather than rupture. Families intermarried within expected social boundaries. There was no evidence of consanguinity that might explain genetic irregularity. No clusters of congenital illness. No whispered scandals preserved in the margins of history. If anything, her lineage was exemplary in its normality. This should have resolved the mystery. Instead, it deepened it. The more her ancestry was confirmed, the less room there was for explanation. If the records were accurate, and there was no compelling reason to doubt them, then her blood profile could not be dismissed as the result of misattributed parentage. This forced the physicians to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that their models of inheritance were insufficient. At the time, this was a radical idea. Genetics was still consolidating its authority. Mendelian principles were being taught as universal laws, not provisional frameworks. To suggest that a healthy adult could emerge from a documented lineage and yet violate those laws was to question the very foundation of the discipline. Such a challenge could not be taken lightly. The language used in the case notes reflects this tension. Phrases like lineage verified appear alongside annotations questioning their significance. One note remarks that the ancestry is consistent with expectation, followed by another in a different hand that adds, yet incompatible with findings. This juxtaposition captures the impasse. The past refused to yield an answer, and the present offered none. As the inquiry continued, attention turned to more speculative possibilities. Could there have been an undocumented event generations earlier? An unrecorded adoption? A falsified birth? These suggestions were floated, then quietly abandoned. The social and administrative structures of the region made such omissions unlikely, especially on the scale required to explain her anomaly. To invoke a hidden rupture in the lineage was to introduce a hypothesis more fragile than the anomaly itself. Some physicians began to consider explanations that bordered on the theoretical fringe of their time. Dual inheritance, mixed origin, biological processes not yet described. These ideas were not recorded explicitly, but hints appear in the margins, question marks, underlined phrases, references to obscure journal articles. They suggest minds stretching beyond accepted boundaries, then recoiling. The patient, meanwhile, remained largely invisible in this genealogical excavation. Her life was reduced to a series of relationships and dates, abstracted into a diagram that sought to explain her existence without her participation. There is no record of her being asked about her family history directly. Oral testimony, which might have introduced nuance or uncertainty, was apparently deemed less reliable than ink on paper. This reliance on documentation over lived experience reflects a broader tendency of the era. Institutions trusted records more than people, especially when those people lack status. The woman's own understanding of her family, stories, rumors, unspoken truths, was irrelevant to a system that valued official validation above all else. As the investigation stalled, frustration set in. The ancestry had been verified to the extent possible. The blood remained inexplicable. The contradiction persisted. And with it came an unspoken fear that the case might not be resolvable within existing frameworks. This fear is evident in the way the case was discussed among specialists. Correspondence from the period, though fragmentary, suggests a growing reluctance to engage with the implications. The anomaly was acknowledged, but not embraced. It was something to be noted, then set aside. The alternative, to accept that heredity might operate in ways not yet understood, was too destabilizing. The phrase that appears most often in relation to this stage of the case is deceptively simple: no precedent. In medicine, lack of precedent is both a challenge and a threat. It invites exploration, but it also undermines authority. Without precedent, there is no guidance. And without guidance, there is risk. For the woman, this meant prolonged uncertainty. Her case could not move forward without resolution, but resolution seemed increasingly unattainable. She remained under observation, not because she was deteriorating, but because she represented an unresolved question. Her body was stable, her classification was not. The genealogical investigation also had a symbolic dimension. Bloodlines carried cultural weight far beyond biology. They were tied to identity, belonging, and legitimacy. In a post-imperial society grappling with questions of nationhood and cohesion, the idea that blood could defy classification was unsettling. It suggested that the boundaries people relied upon, between families, communities, even nations, might be more porous than assumed. This broader unease likely influenced how the case was handled. The anomaly was not just a medical curiosity, it was a potential ideological disruption. Better to confine it to a file than allow it to ripple outward. By the time the ancestry review concluded, the case had reached a strange equilibrium. Everything that could be verified had been verified. Everything that could be tested had been tested. The contradiction remained intact. The woman's bloodline, according to every available record, should have produced predictable results. It did not. What remained was an uncomfortable truth, that the anomaly was not the product of error or deception, but of reality itself. And reality, when it refuses to align with expectation, becomes something institutions often choose not to see. The genealogical certainty that should have resolved the case instead sealed its fate. With no flaw to correct and no theory to revise, the system had only one option left: to stop asking questions. And in doing so, to allow the woman at the center of it all to quietly slip out of view, leaving behind a bloodline that, on paper, should never have existed at all. By the time the anomaly could no longer be dismissed as laboratory error or genealogical confusion, the case had already crossed a boundary that few patients ever reached. It was no longer confined to physicians and technicians. It had become an institutional concern. This transition is subtle in the surviving records, but unmistakable. Language changes again. References appear to external review, academic consultation, and administrative oversight. The woman herself fades further into the background as the machinery of authority moves into place. In the early 1920s, medicine did not exist in isolation from the state. Universities relied on government support. Hospitals answered to ministries. Scientific credibility was tied to national prestige. When a case threatened to destabilize accepted knowledge, it was not simply a professional issue, it was a political one. This was especially true in a young nation still trying to assert itself as modern, rational, and capable of producing legitimate science. The first indication of state involvement appears as a notation indicating that the case file was duplicated and forwarded. The recipient is not named, only identified by title. This was common practice when sensitive material was reviewed by committees rather than individuals. Responsibility became collective, and accountability diffused. Decisions were no longer made by a single doctor, but by a group whose discussions left little trace. From this point forward, access to the woman's records appears to have been restricted. Fewer signatures appear on subsequent entries. Tests continue, but documentation becomes less descriptive. Where earlier notes attempted to explain, later ones merely confirm. The case shifts from exploration to management. What, exactly, prompted this escalation is not recorded explicitly, but the context offers clues. The anomaly challenged fundamental assumptions about heredity at a time when those assumptions were beginning to underpin broader social theories. Across Europe, biology was being invoked to justify ideas about population health, national strength, and social order. Even before the most extreme consequences of these ideas emerged, there was already a strong incentive to present science as stable and authoritative. An unexplained genetic contradiction did not fit that narrative. The review process itself was likely framed as protective rather than punitive. There is no evidence that those involved believed the woman posed a physical threat. The concern was informational. Her blood represented data that could not be easily explained or controlled. If mishandled, it could invite scrutiny, debate, and public doubt. For institutions invested in certainty, doubt was dangerous. Committees formed during this period rarely documented their internal disagreements. Official conclusions were recorded. Dissent was not. This makes it difficult to reconstruct the full range of opinions involved. However, subtle hints remain. Phrases like no recommendation for publication and case unsuitable for instructional use appear in later annotations. These are not neutral statements. They reflect a decision to contain rather than disseminate. Publication was the currency of scientific legitimacy. To declare a case unsuitable for publication was to deny it existence within the accepted body of knowledge. It did not mean the case was false. It meant it was inconvenient. There are indications that some members of the review process advocated for further investigation. Requests for additional testing appear, though many are marked as deferred or unnecessary. The tone suggests fatigue rather than resolution. The anomaly had persisted long enough to prove itself real, but not long enough to force adaptation. In this grey zone, inertia prevailed. State involvement also brought legal considerations into play. While modern concepts of patient rights were still undeveloped, institutions were nonetheless aware of potential liability. Anomalies raised questions. If the woman were harmed during testing, or if information about her case were leaked, consequences could follow. Restricting access reduced risk. At the same time, the classification of the case as sensitive created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more restricted it became, the more significant it appeared. The anomaly gained weight not because it was understood, but because it was controlled. The woman herself was never formally informed of this change in status. There is no record of her consenting to state-level review, nor of her being notified that her case had been deemed exceptional. From her perspective, the hospital environment may have simply grown quieter. Fewer explanations. Fewer interactions. A sense of waiting without clarity. This distancing is characteristic of bureaucratic intervention. Once a case becomes administrative, the individual at its center becomes secondary. Decisions are made based on categories, risks, and precedents rather than personal circumstances. The woman became a variable to be managed rather than a person to be treated. One of the most telling aspects of this phase is the emergence of classification stamps and codes on the file. These markings indicate restricted circulation, though the exact level of classification is unclear. What matters is the intent, to limit visibility. The anomaly was now officially something to be handled discreetly. Why not destroy the file entirely? Because erasure carries its own risks. Destroyed records invite suspicion. Preserved but inaccessible records allow institutions to retain control while minimizing exposure. The file could be referenced if necessary, but not examined freely. Knowledge was preserved, but quarantined. This approach reflects a broader pattern in the history of science. When confronted with data that challenges foundational assumptions, institutions often choose postponement over confrontation. They delay resolution, hoping that future developments will either explain the anomaly or render it irrelevant. In the meantime, the anomaly is set aside. The woman's case was effectively frozen in this state. It was neither resolved nor rejected. It simply ceased to progress. Tests slowed, then stopped. Consultations became infrequent. The energy that once surrounded the anomaly dissipated, replaced by procedural silence. From an institutional perspective, this was a success. The anomaly had been neutralized. It no longer threatened theory or reputation. From a human perspective, it was a quiet tragedy. The woman remained caught in a system that had no answer for her and no incentive to find one. There is no evidence that the review process concluded with a definitive statement. No summary judgment survives. This absence is itself revealing. Conclusions create responsibility. Silence creates deniability. By leaving the case unresolved, the institutions involved avoided both. The state's role in this process was not overtly oppressive, but it was decisive. By elevating the case to an administrative matter, it ensured that the anomaly would be handled according to institutional priorities rather than individual curiosity or compassion. Those priorities favored stability over truth, control over transparency. In the years that followed, the case would occasionally resurface in oblique ways, referenced without detail or attribution. But by then, its most critical moment had passed. The opportunity to confront the implications openly had been lost. What remained was a file marked, sealed, and quietly retained, a testament to a moment when science encountered something it could not explain, and authority chose to manage the problem not by understanding it, but by containing it. Once the case had been quietly absorbed into the machinery of institutional oversight, the nature of what was done to the woman changed in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, but impossible to ignore. The surviving documents from this period are sparse, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was never intended for public scrutiny. The absence of publication does not imply inactivity. On the contrary, it suggests a phase of controlled inquiry, careful, limited, and deliberately undocumented in any form that might invite later examination. What can be inferred is that the focus shifted away from explanation and toward confirmation. By this stage, the anomaly was no longer in question. Her blood had been tested enough times to establish consistency. What remained was the temptation to explore its boundaries. Not to cure her, but to see how far the anomaly extended, and whether it could be replicated, provoked, or constrained. Testing during this period appears to have been incremental rather than invasive. There is no indication of surgical intervention or procedures that would have left obvious physical harm. This was not the era of dramatic experimentation portrayed in popular imagination. It was quieter, more clinical, and therefore easier to justify. Blood draws became more frequent. Samples were taken under varying conditions, different times of day, different states of health, before and after meals. The goal was not treatment, but pattern recognition. The woman's physiological stability made her an ideal subject. She did not deteriorate under observation. Her vital signs remained within normal limits. This allowed physicians to push the boundaries of testing without triggering alarm. Each new sample reinforced the original contradiction. The anomaly persisted regardless of circumstance. It was not a reaction. It was a state. At least one annotation suggests that transfusion compatibility was discussed, though no record confirms that such a procedure was attempted. In 1921, blood transfusions were still dangerous, and the risk of adverse reaction would have been high even under normal conditions. To attempt one with an anomalous blood profile would have been reckless. The absence of evidence likely reflects restraint rather than mercy. A fatal outcome would have attracted exactly the kind of attention the institutions wished to avoid. Instead, the exploration remained theoretical. Physicians modeled inheritance scenarios on paper, using her blood data as a reference point. These models attempted to reconcile her profile with existing genetic laws by introducing hypothetical variables. Dual inheritance was considered. So was the possibility of undetected biological processes occurring during embryonic development. None of these models held up under scrutiny. Each required assumptions that were themselves unsupported. What makes this phase particularly unsettling is the way ethical considerations appear to fade from the record. Earlier notes occasionally reference the patient's comfort or consent. During this period, such references vanish. The woman becomes a constant, silent presence, assumed rather than acknowledged. Her cooperation is taken for granted. Her autonomy is irrelevant. This shift reflects a broader pattern in early 20th century science. When a case moved from clinical curiosity to theoretical significance, the human element often receded. Subjects became instruments of knowledge rather than recipients of care. The justification was implicit. The pursuit of understanding outweighed individual discomfort, especially when that individual lacked the social standing to resist. There is also evidence that external observers reviewed the findings during this phase. Not formally, not in writing, but through private consultations. Academic visitors, ministry advisors, and senior figures in medical circles were reportedly given access to summaries rather than raw data. This controlled exposure allowed the anomaly to be acknowledged without granting it legitimacy. It existed, but only in whispers. No papers were submitted. No lectures were given. The anomaly was discussed only in contexts where discretion was assumed. This ensured that no one could later point to a public record and ask why the implications had not been addressed. Silence became a form of containment. The woman herself likely noticed changes, even if she did not understand their cause. The rhythm of her days would have been shaped by testing schedules rather than treatment plans. There were no clear milestones, no progression toward resolution. Just repetition. Blood drawn, notes taken, conversations held beyond her hearing. Waiting without explanation is its own form of harm, though it leaves no visible trace. At some point during this phase, the tone of the documentation becomes almost bureaucratic. Results are noted without commentary. Anomalies are no longer highlighted. They are expected. This normalization of the inexplicable is perhaps the most telling development. What once caused alarm had become routine. Not because it was understood, but because it had been accepted as unsolvable within current frameworks. This acceptance marked the beginning of the end. When curiosity gives way to resignation, inquiry loses momentum. The anomaly ceased to provoke urgency. It became a known unknown, something acknowledged, but no longer pursued. The experiments that were never published were not dramatic revelations or forbidden procedures. They were quieter, more insidious in their implications. They represent a moment when science encountered its own limits and chose management over confrontation. The woman's body was used to confirm that the limit existed, not to push beyond it. In modern terms, this phase raises profound ethical questions. Informed consent was absent. Oversight was minimal. The patient's right to understand what was being done to her was never considered. Yet judged by the standards of the time, these actions would not have seemed extraordinary. They were consistent with a system that prioritized knowledge over individuals, especially individuals deemed socially insignificant. What is perhaps most striking is that, despite all this scrutiny, nothing changed for the woman herself. She did not receive a diagnosis. She did not receive treatment. The experiments yielded data, but no answers. The anomaly remained intact, and she remained defined by it. Eventually, the testing slowed. Not because it had reached a conclusion, but because it had exhausted its utility. There was nothing new to learn without challenging existing theory, and that challenge had already been deferred. The woman's case had become static, a curiosity preserved in amber. The unpublished experiments did not fail in the conventional sense. They succeeded in confirming the anomaly's persistence. What they failed to do was provide a path forward. And without a path forward, the institutions involved chose retreat. The woman's blood had revealed something unsettling, that human biology could exceed the boundaries imposed upon it by early science. Rather than expand those boundaries, the system chose to step back, to preserve what it knew, even at the cost of ignoring what it did not. This phase of quiet experimentation did not produce a breakthrough, but it produced something else, a decision. A decision to stop looking too closely. And once that decision was made, everything that followed became a matter not of discovery, but of disappearance. After months of observation, repeated testing, and theoretical speculation, the woman at the center of the anomaly began to vanish from the records. Her presence, once meticulously documented through daily examinations, blood tests, and annotations, grew increasingly faint. It was not a dramatic disappearance, not the result of a single event. It was gradual, bureaucratic, almost imperceptible. The dates in the hospital ledger began to skip. Appointments were recorded without her name, referenced only by a case number. Entries in her file became sparse, terse, and eventually, incomplete. Each omission was a small act of erasure, a layer of absence accumulating over time. No formal discharge paperwork survives. No death certificate can be reliably linked to her identity. Census records from the period, which might have provided clues, show inconsistencies. Names that resemble hers appear briefly, only to vanish again in subsequent records. Parish registries are similarly unhelpful. There is no evidence of marriage, relocation, or institutionalization. Even casual mentions that might have corroborated her continued existence are conspicuously absent. It is as if she simply evaporated from the social and medical landscape, leaving behind only a trail of fragmented notes and puzzled annotations. The manner of this disappearance raises difficult questions. Did she leave voluntarily, seeking to escape a hospital that had become more of a laboratory than a place of care? Or was she removed deliberately by authorities who recognized that her case was no longer manageable within the constraints of contemporary science? The surviving documents offer no answer, only hinting at administrative decisions that prioritize containment over clarity. Whatever occurred, it was executed quietly, with no witnesses recorded and no public acknowledgement. The disappearance itself became part of the anomaly. Historians and medical researchers examining the case later noted that her erasure is consistent with practices of the time, particularly regarding patients whose conditions defied explanation. In early 20th century Europe, when an individual's existence threatened institutional certainty, the preferred solution was often archival suppression rather than confrontation. A file could be closed, a record could be annotated with minimal information, and a human being could effectively be written out of history without leaving a trace of coercion or violence. The result was a paradox. She existed materially, yet she was absent in every meaningful narrative sense. The silence surrounding her disappearance was not limited to the hospital. External consultants and state officials who had reviewed the case left no formal commentary once her file ceased to be updated. Academic circles, which had initially speculated cautiously about the implications of her anomalous blood, gradually stopped mentioning her altogether. Conferences, lectures, and journals that might have provided a platform for discussion contained only oblique references to unexplained cases or anomalous inheritance patterns, never identifying her by name. The anomaly itself became abstracted from the individual, a theoretical problem divorced from its living subject. This erasure also underscores the social dynamics of the period. Women, particularly those of modest means, occupied a precarious position within both medical and administrative hierarchies. The woman in question had no political influence, no financial independence sufficient to demand accountability, and no social network capable of contesting institutional authority. Her anonymity made her erasure administratively easy and culturally unremarkable. The very factors that had rendered her a suitable subject for study, her compliance, her ordinary social status, and her invisibility, also rendered her vulnerable to historical disappearance. The files that survive suggest a slow process of administrative distancing. Initially, entries were detailed and descriptive, chronicling symptoms, test results, and speculative hypotheses. Later, they become perfunctory. Laboratory results are noted without context. Annotations reference prior pages rather than adding new observations. Eventually, entries cease altogether. The file itself, once a living document, becomes static. Its silence speaks volumes. The absence of active documentation mirrors the erasure of the individual from institutional consciousness. Modern researchers examining the case often interpret these gaps as evidence of deliberate suppression. The anomaly represented a threat not only to the credibility of the physicians involved, but to the authority of the institutions themselves. To acknowledge it publicly, or even in detailed internal reports, would have risked undermining accepted scientific norms. By quietly withdrawing attention, the institutions preserve stability at the cost of transparency. Her disappearance was a means of containing uncertainty. At the same time, there are tantalizing hints that she may have persisted outside formal records. A brief mention in a distant parish note, a misfiled laboratory slip, a reference in correspondence between academics. These fragments suggest she may have survived beyond the immediate hospital environment. But none provide confirmation. She remains a ghost in the archives, glimpsed only in the edges of documentation, never in the center. This ambiguity reinforces the sense of unease surrounding her case. It is impossible to know whether she continued her life in anonymity or became entirely subsumed into the machinery that had studied her. The psychological dimension of this disappearance is difficult to reconstruct. We can speculate that she experienced confusion, frustration, and isolation. A patient accustomed to routine care suddenly finds herself unacknowledged, her presence minimized in every interaction. The very systems designed to provide guidance and support now treat her as a variable to be monitored or an anomaly to be contained. The erasure is not violent, but it is profound. It is a form of invisibility that leaves no concrete trace of suffering, yet constitutes harm nonetheless. From an institutional perspective, the disappearance served multiple purposes. It prevented public scrutiny, mitigated professional liability, and neutralized a scientific problem that lacked resolution. By removing her from active consideration, the anomaly could be acknowledged without requiring explanation. The contradiction in her blood remained, but the human subject did not. Her existence became a footnote rather than a case study, a problem in theory divorced from the individual it originated from. The disappearance also has broader implications for our understanding of early 20th century medical practice. It demonstrates how institutions could exercise authority over knowledge, not just bodies. Control was exerted not through violence, but through documentation, categorization, and omission. By managing the record, authorities managed reality itself. The woman became an object lesson in the limits of knowledge, the fragility of identity, and the ease with which a life could be rendered absent when it challenged prevailing assumptions. In the end, what survives of her case is not a complete narrative, but fragments. These fragments are enough to establish that her existence was anomalous, her bloodline unprecedented, and her treatment extraordinary in its quiet intensity. They are not enough to tell us where she went, what became of her, or how she understood her own disappearance. That absence is, paradoxically, the defining feature of the story. Her disappearance from the records mirrors the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the case, a life that should not exist according to every principle known at the time, and yet did, leaving behind a void that continues to haunt both history and science. Modern genetics offers tools and frameworks that were unimaginable in 1921, yet when contemporary scientists examine the records of this woman from Prague, the questions remain deeply unsettling. Even with access to advanced sequencing, chromosomal mapping, and molecular analysis, her case resists easy categorization. In many ways, revisiting it through the lens of modern science exposes not only the limits of early 20th century medicine but also the enduring complexity of human biology itself. The very anomalies that confounded her physicians can now be interpreted in ways that are simultaneously enlightening and deeply unsettling. One of the first possibilities considered by modern researchers is mosaicism, a condition in which a single individual has two or more populations of cells with distinct genotypes. In some cases, this can create unexpected blood type markers or unusual patterns of inheritance that appear contradictory. In most documented cases, mosaicism arises from early developmental mutations that are distributed unevenly across the body. While mosaicism could account for certain aspects of her blood anomaly, it does not fully explain the consistency and breadth of the contradiction recorded in the archival data. Her blood appeared anomalous in a stable, reproducible way, suggesting something more pervasive than the patchwork of genetic variation usually associated with mosaicism. Chimerism offers another possible explanation. Unlike mosaicism, chimerism involves two distinct zygotes merging in early development, resulting in a single individual with two genetically distinct cell lines. In theory, this could produce conflicting markers in blood analysis, creating the appearance of impossible inheritance. Chimerism has been documented in rare cases and is sometimes discovered only incidentally, often during paternity tests or organ transplantation. While intriguing, chimerism is exceedingly rare and cannot account for every feature of her profile, particularly when all records suggest her parents were biologically documented and unremarkable. In other words, even modern genetic concepts struggle to reconcile the anomaly completely. A third possibility lies in mutations so rare they were essentially invisible to science in 1921. Spontaneous genetic mutations can produce traits that appear inconsistent with known inheritance patterns, especially when multiple loci are affected in unexpected combinations. Modern genome sequencing has revealed countless instances of such rare variations, many of which would have been incomprehensible to early geneticists. Yet even today, mutations alone rarely create the kind of wholesale contradiction observed in her case without introducing some physiological irregularity. According to surviving reports, she exhibited none of these overt signs. She was outwardly healthy, functional, and physically ordinary. This makes the anomaly particularly resistant to explanation, even with current knowledge. Beyond biological possibilities, modern researchers also consider the limitations of historical records. Errors in documentation, misattributed parentage, or incomplete family histories could partially account for apparent contradictions. Yet the surviving archival work suggests that her lineage was scrutinized meticulously, with multiple sources cross-checked to confirm consistency. While minor errors are always possible, the scale and reproducibility of the anomaly suggest that the problem was not a clerical oversight but a genuine biological contradiction. The persistence of her anomaly across multiple tests, locations, and observers further complicates the picture. Even modern laboratories, with all their advanced technology, could not replicate the exact conditions under which her blood was analyzed in 1921. Yet when researchers attempt to model her case using contemporary principles, the results remain troublingly ambiguous. Some computational reconstructions suggest that a combination of rare genetic events could, in theory, reproduce aspects of the anomaly. However, these scenarios require multiple independent improbabilities aligning perfectly, a statistical rarity bordering on impossibility. This reinforces the sense that her existence challenged not just early science but the very assumptions underlying probability and inheritance. In revisiting the case, ethical considerations also arise. Modern researchers approach it with a heightened awareness of patient autonomy, informed consent, and privacy, concepts that were absent in her original care. The woman's voice remains absent, her experiences recorded only through the lens of institutional documentation. Any attempt to reinterpret her anomaly today must grapple with the fact that she was treated primarily as a subject for observation rather than a human being. This awareness does not diminish the scientific intrigue, but it does frame the anomaly in a moral as well as biological context. Comparisons to contemporary anomalies in genetics further highlight the enduring mystery of her case. Modern medicine has documented individuals with unusual chromosomal arrangements, rare blood type expressions, and unexplained inheritance patterns. Yet these cases almost always include some measurable physiological consequence, whether in immune function, developmental variation, or reproductive outcomes. Her case, as reconstructed from historical records, is anomalous without compromise. She existed fully, functioned normally, and yet contradicted established patterns of heredity. This rare combination continues to fascinate and unsettle geneticists. The broader implications are equally striking. Her anomaly forces a re-evaluation of what is possible within human biology. If a documented bloodline can produce results previously considered impossible, then assumptions about inheritance, lineage, and biological determinism require careful reconsideration. It also challenges the notion of absolute certainty in science. Even today, with unprecedented technological power, there are phenomena that elude explanation, reminding us that knowledge is provisional and that the human organism remains, in many ways, a frontier. Modern interpretations also recognize the cultural and historical dimensions of the case. At the time, her anomaly was not just a scientific curiosity, it was a social and ideological problem. Today, it continues to fascinate because it represents a collision of human individuality with institutional structures of knowledge. It is a reminder that science is both powerful and limited, capable of extraordinary discovery but constrained by pre-existing frameworks and assumptions. Her existence sits at the intersection of these tensions, a real human life whose biological signature defied expectation, whose experience was mediated by authority, and whose anomaly persists as a question mark even a century later. Ultimately, examining her through modern genetics does not resolve the mystery, it reframes it. We can propose hypotheses, model scenarios, and understand the mechanisms that might explain her existence. But the case retains an aura of defiance. It underscores the limits of certainty, the provisional nature of knowledge, and the persistent human fascination with what should not exist but does. The woman's bloodline, preserved in fragments of documentation and the lingering echoes of institutional memory, continues to challenge our understanding of heredity. Even now, it reminds us that science, for all its advances, may still encounter phenomena that it cannot fully explain, leaving questions that endure, unsettling and profound.